we are co-hosting. Hello, okay. This is, as you said, it's an early start, first session of the week. But this and the following one after lunch is the one that we are co-organizing with NUPI. Indeed, we are tremendously delighted to be organized these first two panels with the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and the Researching for the Effectiveness of Peace Operations network. One of the leading themes during this year's Geneva Peace Week is multilateralism in transition. International relations and conduct, as we have known it for the past 70 years, is arguably gone. The current almost tectonic shifts in great power relations and rivalry and the great powers' respective changing geopolitical priorities and commitments is having an impact and will have an impact on most, if not all, areas of international cooperation and engagement. So, in this new emerging environment, what role can and will peace operations and peace missions play? With the current drawdown in resources for collective international interventions, how can we ensure that the resources that are still available are used in the most effective way? In light of these developments, and in the next hour and 15 minutes, we will explore the effectiveness of the OSCE and EU peace missions in Ukraine. What can we learn from these missions? Have they been, or are they, effective and meeting the aims and purposes of their deployments? Can peace operations prevent conflict? Or prevent the outbreak of large-scale violence and fighting, at least? Can peace missions contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? If so, how? Ladies and gentlemen, since 2014 and the outbreak of the war, 13,000 men, women and children have been killed in Ukraine. More than 1.5 million people have been displaced. And despite the development of ceasefire roadmaps already in 2014 and 15, and while the Minsk Accords have been said to, if not prevent conflict, at least contribute to a decrease in the fighting and the level of violence in the periods that follow. But given the absence of true political will, the ceasefires failed to hold and the conflict continued. And then almost all of a sudden, not even a week ago, last Tuesday, after 5 years of war, Ukrainian forces and Russian-backed separatists began pulling back from the front line in Ukraine. It has long been recognized that peacekeeping or peace operations is really the extension of politics by other means. The situation which is currently unfolding in Ukraine, however tentative it is, speaking with Alexander just prior to this panel, might just be the ultimate testimony to this core understanding of the possibilities and constraints of peace operations. So, looking to the panel, can peace operations prevent conflict, or can it at least or merely prevent large-scale violence? Despite all its shortcomings, to what extent and how can peace operations make a positive, concrete difference in support of the sustaining peace agenda? What makes peace operations effective or not? Is it the context? Is it the missions themselves, their resources and mandates? And what factors come into play for a mission to be successful or not? The good news is we have everything this morning on this panel that is required for an insightful and productive discussion on this topic. Dr. Cedric de Koning will soon introduce the EPON network and its methodology in just a few minutes. But let me already say that the foundation for this panel is based on the accumulative work of the Researching for Effectiveness network. EPON is a truly trailblazing effort, spearheaded by NUPI under Cedric's uniting and unwavering guidance. It is a truly global research project involving some of you in this room, but also some 40 institutions from across the world. It is in this time of multilateralism in transition or even crisis, I highly commend the work of EPON as an effort and project, which is one of the best examples, I would say, of a healthy and effective multilateralism-focused tool and platform to advance all of our collective security, through its contribution to strengthening peace operations. After Cedric has spoken, Dr. Joachim Koopts from Leiden University, who is the lead researcher for the Ukraine study, will take us through the state and aims of the EPON study on Ukraine. He will outline some of the initial findings and will also cover the EU dimension and extent to which it manages to complement the OSCE mission. Joe will then put it all in context, to what extent the missions contribute to the overall sustainable development goals. And finally, Alexander Hook, who was first Deputy Chief Monitor for the OSCE mission in Ukraine from the very start, all through last year, will share his perspective on how a peace operation should best be assessed and evaluated. Alexander will briefly outline the parallel tracks of the Minsk process and the mandate of the OSCE in Ukraine. He will provide a short update on the current situation in eastern Ukraine, and in so doing, share with us some of the key challenges of the OSCE operation in Ukraine. You have the biographies of the speakers as part of the program, so I will go straight to opening the panel and start by handing over the word to Cedric to give us the gist of EPON framework and the focus. And before doing so, let me also just tell you that the session is live streamed, and therefore no Chatham House rules apply. What is said in Geneva is known to the world. So, now, Cedric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Annika. Thank you so much, all of you, for braving the weather and joining us for this session. The focus is going to be on Ukraine, but I'll just kick us off by sharing with you in a little bit of a larger context what this effectiveness of peace operation network is about, what we are trying to achieve, and where this particular study on Ukraine fits in. So I'm with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs in Norway, and we are the coordinators, or the secretariat, if you like, of this network. But as Annika said, we have more than 40 institutions across the world that have come together and are collaboratively doing research into specific peace operations as part of this network. So I'm going to touch a little bit base on the studies that we've done and that are currently underway, and share with you a little bit about the methodology and about the partners and a little bit about the project. I won't go into everything that you see on the slide there, but perhaps just to say about the origin, we had the opportunity to be involved in supporting the UN High-Level Panel on Peace Operations when it did its study in 2015. And one of the things that came out of that experience is they asked us to organize 2 what they called success factor workshops. And we really realized through that experience that there's very little research into factors that determine effectiveness of specific peace operations. Most of the research out there, is somebody who has a hypothesis that they would like to test, and they look at a couple of case studies, but that doesn't help us to understand in the specific context and the reality of a particular operation, what is it that has influenced or that will influence in future the effectiveness of that specific operation. So that led us to want to undertake this research. And then we quickly realized that it's too much to do for one particular institution. It also wouldn't be credible if one institution from the global north does this kind of research. And so that's why we decided to create a network with research institutions from across the globe that can collaboratively undertake this research. And so we started in 2017 with bringing a lot of people together, deciding to kick off the idea. And then in 2018, we started with a number of research studies. And we hope to continue with this project as long as we have funding and support. And in the process, develop a hopefully quite a comprehensive data set on the effectiveness of specific peace operations. So this is the studies that we've undertaken so far. In 2018, we looked at the African Union mission in Somalia, at the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, at the UN mission in Mali, and at the UN mission in South Sudan. These were all, as I mentioned, collaborative teams of several institutions that have come together and that have undertaken these studies. And these reports are all available on the website. The MINUSMA report, there's currently only an executive summary available, but I hope that we will have that report published in the next 10 days or so. And then currently we have a number of studies underway. You'll see there we have the joint African Union United Nations hybrid mission in Darfur, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that mission in particular in the session after lunch. And then we have a team that have been to the Central African Republic in July, led by Professor Lise Maury-Howard from Georgetown University. We're going to talk now about the study that we have underway looking into the European Union and OSCE missions in Ukraine. And we also have a team that is looking at the United Nations verification mission in Colombia. What's quite interesting and I think challenging in this particular discussion we're going to have today is that, as you notice, of course, a lot of the focus has been on United Nations operations and the more kind of multi-dimensional big peacekeeping operations. So it'll be interesting for us to see, how, to what degree can this methodology that we've embarked upon and this approach also be applied to other operations such as, UN special political missions like the one in Colombia or the European Union OSCE type operations. So this is something why this particular study we're going to discuss now I think is quite important and groundbreaking for us. So just a few quick words about our methodology. So we have, as I mentioned, collaborative teams for each of these studies, and of course all the researchers involved in these studies come with their own experiences, their own theoretical and methodological knowledge, and we've selected people like Joe to lead the study because of their research experience, so of course we rely on that a lot. But we have come up with a kind of a shared methodology to enable us to compare the studies with each other over time, especially in the context of trying to develop a common data set over time. And so you see there on the screen the kind of things we look at, essentially three key things. We look at the context to situate our analysis in the specific reality of that mission. We try to understand what effect this mission has had by looking at especially its impact on let's say, immediate security issues, stability, protection, but also at sustaining peace, at peace building, at durable peace. And then we use a number of explanatory factors. You see the list there of 8 on the screen to try and, especially over time, look to what degree these kind of factors play a role. These are factors that have come out of either key doctrinal documents like the United Nations Capstone Doctrine that have identified these as some of the key factors that should influence effectiveness, and also, of course, out of our experience with a high-level panel on peace operations and so forth. And again, these have definitely been informed by the United Nations peacekeeping experience, so interesting, again, to challenge how well they travel across the European Union, OSCE, African Union, and other experiences. We also focus on a number of specific topics, so we're looking especially at women, peace and security at the moment across the different studies and see what we can learn if we look at how the women, peace and security agenda is being pursued in these different studies. We're starting now with a very interesting kind of subtopic on logistics and mission support, something normally left out of the main discussion, but we've got a number of mission support and logistic experts that's going to start, especially in our study on Darfur, to look into that. We've had a number of people with a special interest on policing, and of course protection of civilians is a key topic of interest to most of us in this field. So these are some of the particular topics that we are tracking across the different studies, and that we hope that these studies will contribute to greater insight into effectiveness in these specific areas, in addition to peace operation at large. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see a couple of the kind of institutional focuses. Our focus on United Nations peace operations, also special political missions, more in the future, African Union and sub-regional organizations, but also EU, OSCE, perhaps NATO, perhaps others in future. We're having our annual meeting actually next week in New York, where we will decide which studies to continue with in 2020 and 2021. These are some of the ones on the wish list that you see on the screen, but we'll make a decision. It depends a lot on the different partners, what they are interested in, what they have funding for. Because this network is mostly self-funded, partners come to the network with their own funding, with their own research interests. We put those together and we see what is possible based on that. So I hope that gave you a little bit of an idea of the network and the kind of things we look at. In the session after lunch, we will go into a bit more detail. We'll focus on the Darfur study, but I'll also share with you some of the emerging trends and observations based on the first four studies that we've done so far. So thank you very much. Let me hand back to you then, or shall I hand over to Joe?
I think Joe.
Okay, so Joe, let me hand over to you.
Well, good morning, and first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. Also, thanks to Cedric and the entire EPON network. It's big pleasure to be here and discuss the, study in its very early phases with you. And I'm also looking very much forward to dialogue with Alexander, who will be, of course, very well placed to give talk about his experience and detailed assessments. As Cedric mentioned, it's a bit of a special case within the EPON network. Also for myself, I did a lot of work on UN peacekeeping, and now applying both the knowledge and framework on evaluating UN peacekeeping and the EPON framework to a non-EU mission is both exciting and brings some challenges. But if we try to look at the basic framework of evaluating effectiveness that EPON has developed, it is also surprising how much it actually doesn't matter which organization you look at. The goals and aims, and also by and large the mandates, are very, very similar. But of course there's one specificity with Ukraine and the OSCE approach. It's a conflict that leaves limited room of maneuver. It is a situation where the OSCE found itself, where the initial mandate was completely geared differently to a situation that has changed fundamentally on the ground. So adaptation and transformation and the level of flexibility is one of the key aspects we're looking into that the OSCE mission has achieved. And of course, there's also a very restricted context in terms of political deadlock and what the political side of the OSCE mission can do. When we started setting up the evaluation team, Lisa Howard from Georgetown University is part of it, but also former officers in the OSCE mission itself, now Samir Puri, a professor at King's College, Julia Terkovich from the Global Governance Institute. We realized very quickly that it also would be useful to look into the EU dimension. Of course, the EU mission is, again, an entirely different kettle of fish. There was the aim to have a common security defense policy operation in Ukraine that would also do conflict resolution by some member states. There were also then quite clear signals from a variety of EU member states that it should be very clear that any involvement that could even be perceived as dealing with the conflict itself should be avoided at all costs. So what you have then is essentially a CSDP operation that looks very much like a commission-driven tool, which really targets governance reform, security sector reform, and also tackling many of the issues that are labeled under the key theme of building resilience of Ukraine as a state. So if we combine the OSCE mission and the EU mission, and I was also asked to talk today about how it links to the Sustainable Development Goals, then it actually is quite interesting to see how much both operations directly link to Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, by combining both aspects. Of course, on the first important aspect that the OSCE seeks to address is to reduce all forms of violence, which is of course the key aspect of SDG 16. It does so in a very difficult and volatile situation. It does so also in terms of having adapted from a mission that started out with 100 observers to now 1,200. And the EU side, on the other hand, is dealing with SDG goals such as the aspect of reducing corruption and bribery in all forms, which is SDG 16.5, and also developing effective, transparent and accountable institutions. So if we already start from the vantage point that we look into how can international organizations dealing with the Ukraine conflict contribute to SDGs, then of course the heading under 16 in that combined way is a good illustration. So the EU on the one hand tackling the institution building, building and supporting reform processes with a variety of challenges, and the OSCE tackling the situation of the conflict. Before moving into some of the initial aspects that we're looking into and we're going to explore further, we have the first field trip lined up in January. There will be a second field trip in March. There will also, of course, be discussions with people that have formerly served in both missions, or as well as people at headquarters. We had the first rounds of interviews in Brussels on the EU side of things just 2 weeks ago. But if we look at some of the key aspects of the OSCE operation, we were trying to look at 5 major aspects. First of all, concrete instances where the OSCE mission made a measurable difference, both, and these are on 2 pillars, both in terms of on the ground and at the political diplomatic level. Secondly, we of course try to identify the key challenges, and these go of course beyond the well-known challenges of the political situation, of the variety of difficulties facing that it is being faced in terms of constant violations of the ceasefire, constant violations of from both sides in terms of shelling and hostile acts. But what are the challenges of the mission beyond the obvious aspects? Where could improvements be made within the operation? And then how, and that's in particular, yeah.
Do you mean to show it on the screen?
What? No, that's just some, sorry, no, it's not. And then as a final aspect, we're looking into how the OSCE fits into the inter-organizational network. So how does the mission and mission leadership, but also people on the ground, cooperate with the EU, but also the UN and other NGOs and civil society aspects. Now, if it's about conflict prevention per se, of course the radius and the ability the OSCE has is, again, limited. It requires a political solution, but a reduction of tensions, and many instances of reduction of tensions could already be recorded. There's also support to protecting and rebuilding infrastructure. If we think about instances, for example, where, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine, a variety of targeted destructions of infrastructure, such as the filtration facility in the eastern part, needs to be, first of all, quickly identified, and then also addressed in terms of bringing support in. There the OSCE mission is playing an important role in facilitating repair, in essentially trying to support the situation of the civilian population through very responsive and quick action on infrastructure aspects. There is strong cooperation with the UN on the ground, which also, again, in terms of supporting civilians when it's about access to water. And of course, there are also cooperation aspects in terms of work with NGOs. If we think about the aftermath of the 2014 Odessa incident, where a variety of incidents with protesters, where then afterwards a variety of roundtables were being organized with NGOs in terms of violence prevention. The aspects of the liaison teams, which worked or was set up in 2016 and worked reasonably well, is now, of course, in a different situation since the Russians withdrew in 2017. So the different ways of how ceasefire violations could be discussed is now, in that sense, more difficult. Nevertheless, an important aspect that we're going to look into also a bit further is how the OSCE is carrying out early warning mechanisms and how it seeks to reassure the civilian population in the eastern part of Ukraine. And there we look, for example, also at one of the aspects of the methodology of EPON, the EPON study, which looks at protection of civilians. And here we also see the tensions that we also see very often in UN operations, where the expectations of the population towards protection of civilians, particularly when members of the mission are present, is often, of course, difficult to match in terms of the mandate and the capacities and the abilities that people on the ground have. First of all, the territory is a very vast one to cover. Secondly, the OSCE mission per se is not equipped to engage in active protection of civilians, as we know it, for example, from UN peacekeeping operations. But there are also instances that we want to evaluate further to what extent the sheer presence of members of the OSCE mission avoids, of course, escalation of tensions and conflicts. There are two ways of looking at it. In some areas, for example, reports are when OSCE people are present, then activities or violence is in fact halted. But then, of course, as soon as OSCE monitors depart, these instances of violence flare up again. A final aspect that will also be interesting to look at is to what extent improvements and further policies can be applied within the current limited mandate, or to what extent discussions at the political level of changing and adapting the mandate are either desirable or in fact possible. Again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a case of a mission that started out on a completely different context and original mandate. It had to adapt without major adaptations to the mandate itself. We will also look at some of the technical approaches of the mission, particularly the use of drones, something that has been controversial in UN operations, but also something that is being now introduced and appreciated in the context of the OSCE mission. Right, finally, when we look at how the OSCE and the EU interact, there is a pretty neat division of labor here, because again, for political reasons, the EU CSDP is limited mostly to reform aspects in terms of security sector reform, reforming the justice system, building institutions, and tackling the aspect of corruption. The third player we're going to look into further is interaction with the UN, but also on the EU side, cooperation with civil society support, particularly the European Endowment for Democracy. Right. So these are some of the aspects we have been discussing so far. We're now in the process of preparing a catalogue of questions and key research aspects for the first field trip in January, and followed up by also discussions in Vienna and Brussels, with further results then planned for April, May. But these are some of the aspects where we are right now and how it could relate to the Sustainable Development Goals in that case. Thanks very much.
Right, thank you very much, Joe. We would like to, in order to have such as a comprehensive conversation as possible, we agreed that we would have the 3 presentations straight away and then open up for an interactive conversation. But having said that, is anyone in the need of some clarification on the first 2 presentations? Specifics that were unclear? Otherwise, we steam ahead with the third panelist before we open up for a comprehensive conversation. So, Mr. over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming through the rain to our panel here today. Thank you, Annika, and panel members here that I could join you. I'm trying to, as outlined in the beginning, try to explain you how difficult it is to assess the operation of the OSCE in Ukraine, not least because of the development of the implementation of its mandate. Now, at least at first look, if you would like to assess the OSCE's effectiveness on the ground, you would look at the ceasefire, and it is clear from the reports that the OSCE still today, every day, reports daily publicly on its website that on average there are 1,000 counted ceasefire violations on a single day registered by the special monitoring mission. And that by itself makes it then very clear that if you look only at the violence itself, that it becomes very difficult to assess whether or not the mission is effective. What is even more problematic is whether or not you could actually attribute a seen or monitored de-escalation to a specific action by the third party, by the special monitoring mission. Now, what also has become obvious and is in connection with what I've said before is the OSCE's becoming a buffer between the sides, in multiple plurals, directly at the contact line, and the buffer only works as long as we have just heard before, the OSCE is present. However, the threshold of not resuming fire when the OSCE is present has also been decreasing over the years, and even in the presence of the special monitoring mission, the sides then resumed fighting and continued fighting. So all the OSCE then managed to achieve is a temporary reprieve, at least at first look, and that is very important there. Now, what is worse, the presence of the OSCE between the sides over time became also often a conditionality in negotiations, meaning that we will only stop firing when you are there present. We will only allow the repair of infrastructure if you are present. And at that point, often the OSCE in itself became part of the equation, of the problem in itself. And that, of course, is something that is then also difficult to assess because you become part of the actual situation there itself. Now, what the OSCE has done over time, and my colleagues of the panel have briefly outlined that already before, is to take positive steps to shore up these short-term successes at the contact line, these temporary reprieves, by making sure that violence is not reoccurring, not just by presence or by counting ceasefire violation, but for instance by fostering dialogue across the contact line. As you know, and we see that later with the part on the challenges I would like to outline to you, it is not entirely clear to anyone, depending where you ask, who is party to that conflict. If you ask the question in Moscow, you get an answer. If you ask it in Kiev, you get a different one. You get a nuance to that when you ask the question in Donetsk and Luhansk. Fact is, however, that the sides do not directly, formally talk with one another. Some sides do, some sides don't. And where they don't do, in particular at the contact line, there the special monitoring mission has shown its ability to facilitate indirect dialogue, therefore at the very municipal level, trying to resolve some of the tension that grew in order to prevent further escalation. So fostering dialogue there has helped. It has helped in particular also to make sure that the effects of the conflict were mitigated. The effects on human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, and not just the very obvious one, the right to life, but also the other rights in terms of protecting facilities that are needed for either education or then further economic production in the area. As you know, the conflict area has been the industrial area in Ukraine heavily affected by the conflict. Prevention, therefore, has also become part of the OSCE's work at the contact line itself. The Sustainable Development Goals that have been mentioned before have been a good catalogue that helped the OSCE to define some of these areas where positive steps had to be taken. And up front, goal number 5, 10, and 16, as already mentioned, come to my mind if I look back at the work of the OSCE. However, all of these goals have been and should be taken into account, be it only to make sure that those agencies, including UN agencies that are dedicated to focus on these areas, have access to those locations, for instance. And therefore, by providing access, the OSCE also further enhanced the work on these development goals. The dialogue, as I've mentioned itself, was also important to allow the assessment to be made on other aspects of the conflict, not least on the rule of law institutions on both sides of the contact line. The rule of law institutions on the government-controlled side, the UN Special Monitoring Mission there on human rights has issued various reports. The OSCE itself has issued reports on access to justice also beyond areas that the government controls at the moment. Prevention, therefore, also requires early action. Both the UN, for instance, with its concept of human rights up front, has recognized that early action needs to be taken to prevent a conflict to occur or reoccur. The OSCE also has taken on early warning and early action upon to its mandate of several institutions, and this mission also there provided by its reporting early warning to participating states, to the general public, and it's the first mission that makes all of its reports publicly available, early warning for actions to be taken. Now, before I go further on there, I would like to briefly outline you how this mission came together, because that is important also to be able to properly to assess it. You see in front of you a very selective timeline. Many important dates, of course, are missing on this slide, but it starts in early February 2014, there when Crimea was annexed. Then on the 21st of March 2014, that was the date when the Permanent Council of the OSCE has decided to put in place a small-scale monitoring mission, and that was, as you can see now, before the actual conflict has ensued. And the mission there was meant to look after the OSCE commitments in Ukraine, all over Ukraine, after the change from the previous regime to the Poroshenko regime. Within 24 hours, 10 monitors were deployed to 10 cities, 10 monitors each, across Ukraine, and you find it interesting to know that in all of these cities, to which Lviv, Odessa, Ivano-Frankivsk belong, are still monitored by members of the monitoring mission. Naturally now, in the course of the development, the bulk part of the human resources and the attention is, of course, in the eastern part. Then another important date there are 2 dates in April, when first the buildings in the Donetsk city in eastern Ukraine were occupied, and then slightly later in Slavyansk, the first reported violence of the conflict in the middle of April. And then importantly, later in the summer, at the margins of a meeting in Normandy, where France, Germany, Russia and Ukraine met and said something needs to be done to mitigate the conflict, where they have decided a trilateral contact group should be established with a special representative of the OSCE, a representative of Russia and one of Ukraine, to find solutions out of this way. And that trilateral contact group in September then later has signed 2 documents, what is normally referred to as Minsk I. There are actually 2 documents, the protocol and the memorandum, which among other things also stipulated a ceasefire. A third document, which is normally referred to as Minsk II, was then signed in February 2015. That's the package of measures which stipulates in more detail what measures need to be implemented there. And therefore, here, very important, the 2 tracks. You have the yellow part on the slide in front of you there, the Minsk track, if you wish, with the Normandy format, the trilateral contact group, its working groups on security, economy, humanitarian aspects and political aspects. And below there, the Joint Center for Control and Coordination. This was a bilateral arrangement between Russia and Ukraine to discuss reported and monitored ceasefire violations to resolve them. That is meanwhile not operational any longer, as we have heard before, because the Russian side within that bilateral arrangement had departed from it and it's not any longer functional. And the blue part there in front of you, you see the mandate of the Special Monitoring Mission with its two main tasks, which is to facilitate dialogue on the ground and to monitor and report. But it's very important to make that distinction between the monitoring mission, because the SMM, the Special Monitoring Mission, doesn't stand for Special Minsk Mission. Here also to explain for those that are not that familiar with the area in the eastern part of the country is very big and large. The oblast, the two regions that are directly affected by the conflict of Donetsk and Luhansk, have a size of 53,000 square kilometers. That is bigger than the country we are in at the moment. Switzerland's size is about 42,000 square kilometers. The contact line separating government forces from non-government forces is approximately 500 kilometers long, depending on how you measure it. The unsecured border there to the east between Ukraine and the Russian Federation is some 400 kilometers long, and you have an open seashore on the bottom at the Azov Sea of approximately 70 kilometers. So the lines alone around the area where government has no control is 1,000 kilometers, and an area government controlled and non-government controlled as bigger in fact than Switzerland, the country we are in at the moment. Now the current situation, only very briefly to also let you know that the fighting and the continued suffering of the population continues. You see there the figures that I have taken from reports publicly available on the OSCE's website. On the 1st of November, the most recent report I found there, over 500 ceasefire violations reported by the Special Monitoring Mission. In the months from July to September this year, over 50,000 ceasefire violations recorded and reported. And these are only the numbers the mission managed to catch. It's not the entire 500 kilometer long contact lines reality that is reflected in this number. And another interesting number there, over 1,000 weapons. These are tanks, mortars, howitzers, multiple launch rocket systems, been seen and observed on both sides of the contact line in areas where they should not be according to the agreements. For instance, a tank, to name an example, should be 15 kilometers away from the contact line. And if it is counted there among the 1,000, it is closer than that. The situation on the humanitarian side also continues to be troublesome and concerning. You have heard the high death toll that this conflict has produced and continues to produce. The daily fighting along the line also involves large parts of cities. The city of Donetsk, for instance, the northern and western part of that city are at the same time the contact line in itself. Positions are placed inside built-up areas. They themselves become target, and anything that is nearby also becomes heavily affected by it. Infrastructure that people rely on that has zigzagged across that contact line, which did not exist before the conflict ensued. We should not forget that this line was drawn artificially during the conflict. There is no geography that divides the sides there, but that infrastructure that crossed before the conflict over that line and upon which the civilian population relies, gas, electricity, water, is heavily affected by the continued fighting. And what often is overseen and what is important in looking also at the effectiveness of the mission is what happened beyond the tank and the gun that is visible at the contact line. And this is what happens with 5 years plus on hearing different sorts of news, of going to different schools, of paying with different money, of changing civil status under different laws, of earning money under different regimes, of crossing the contact line under very difficult circumstances. This now, 5 years on, soon 6 years on, of course, is a huge burden that has built up apart from the very obvious ceasefire violations that one sees at the contact line itself. Now at the end here, and we don't have the time to go in all of the details, just 4 categories of challenges that I would like to bring to your attention. First is, of course, the agreements themselves, and there are several of them, at least 7 has been signed since September 2014. They have been signed in 2014, now 6 years ago. Since then, the situation on the ground has drastically changed. Much more now would be needed than what had been regulated in the original documents that were 2 pages long. Discounting the signatures, the document would be 1 page long. Regulating a conflict that has been stretching over 500 kilometer long front line, if you wish. The agreements themselves are also problematic because, as I've mentioned before, the format upon which they have been agreed has not been agreed by all those that have signed on these documents. The question as to who is party to the conflict has not been resolved. That also leads directly then to a challenge that the special monitoring mission sees itself, and I leave now the operational challenges aside of the vast area of the technology it uses, but the fact that the mandate of the mission is predating the agreements themselves makes it very difficult for the mission to actually adopt itself to support the implementation of these agreements. No word in the mandate has been changed, and that would require a consensus decision by all 57 participating states. The only thing that has changed is the number of monitors that have been originally assigned from an originally 100 to now being able to deploy just pure monitors, the number of 1,000. But the fact that the mission mandate does not mention the Minsk agreements because it predates it makes it difficult for the mission to fully be at the disposal of the implementation of these agreements. It makes it also very difficult to explain to the concerned civilians on the ground what the mission is doing. The mission itself also needs to explain to participating states what it's doing on the ground and why it's focusing so heavily on the eastern part of the country while the mandate actually covers the entire country. And as you know, 57 participating states have at least 57 opinions as to how this operation should operate on the ground, where it should focus, and it is very difficult then to make sure that those 57 participating states are on board and actually politically supporting this operation, because after all, the special monitoring mission is an instrument of the Permanent Council there. The political challenges I have already touched upon briefly, and the operational challenges, I just want to add one additional that has not been mentioned yet, is that of security. The special monitoring mission is a civilian unarmed operation on the ground, often restricted by the sites, more often in areas not controlled by the government, and that restriction is both physical but also electronically, and often the equipment the mission uses, be it its handheld radio, its mobile phones, but also its technical equipment to monitor the cameras, but also the drones, the UAVs, as they're named in the mission, are electronically interfered with. That is one set of active interference, and there is passive interference too, is because vast areas of the contact line where the mission should be monitoring is mined and inaccessible. There is no active fighting there, but it's simply too dangerous to access these areas. But there is also self-imposed restrictions, because the appetite of participating states to take risks for their monitors, they second to this operation, is not always at the same level, and therefore often the mission imposes restriction on itself that then disables it from monitoring further at the contact line. There would be much more, dear participants and panel members, but I shall leave it at that, and if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you all three panelists for very concise, rich contributions, providing complementary perspectives to the overarching question that we're seeking here to address. To what extent is the missions in Ukraine, have they been effective? Are they still effective? And to what extent do they contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals? I have a number of issues, but I have no doubt we have only 25 minutes, so I would like to open the floor straight away with if there are questions, comments, suggestions. Who wants to take the lead with the first question?